the presentation. Okay, and with that, let's go ahead and start. Let me introduce our speakers today. And so first, I'd like to introduce Professor Cindi Gilliland and also Quamina Carter. With a PhD in social psychology, Professor Gilliland's passions include social innovation, leadership, work-life balance, resilience, and well-being, especially leveraging diversity and inclusion. And as for Quamina, with over 20 years of professional experience in higher education, Quamina serves as the Assistant Vice President of Student Affairs and Dean of Students at CGU. Quamina is also a licensed therapist. Thank you, Cindi and Quamina, for being here today and for leading this webinar. I'm looking forward to your presentation. And with that, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Regina. In our first week, we heard from President Jessup about the importance of seeing around corners, having a high tolerance for change, and being flexible, adaptable, and nimble when creating models of interacting. He spoke about how organizations can best anticipate catalysts for change when their teams represent and respect diverse experiences and perspectives. In the week that followed, Dean Michelle Bly facilitated a discussion around fair leadership and specifically pointed to post-pandemic leadership skills that encompassed financial acumen, collaboration, the ability to build new leaders, communication, strategic planning, commitment to diversity, and intellectual curiosity. And last week, Student Gilliland shared how we can overcome perceptions of injustice. Today, we will dive a bit deeper into our own intersecting identities and the impact that both seen and unseen identities have had on our experiences and the formation of our leadership trajectory. We will explore how biases allow space for exclusion and inequity across our teams and within the communities we serve.
So when we talk about diversity, it's really talking about the ways that each of us are unique and the way that we are positioned in our workplace as part of our own personal identities. It involves, of course, characteristics like race and gender and age. These are the things that people most commonly think of when it comes to diversity initiatives. It also has to do, though, with unseen and hidden identities and with positions of power relative to our organizations.
Cindi, I can relate to this, and if you don't mind, I'll just jump in here. Each one of us has identities that are known internally that may not be seen externally. We also have a perception of how these identities fit within our organizations and society. So for example, in higher education and student affairs, I think an assumption that has commonly been made about me, and perhaps due to my placement and advocacy in the field, is that I'm a first-generation college student, when in fact, in my family, I was not a first-generation undergraduate or graduate student. If you're comfortable, I invite our audience to share in the chat an example of an unseen identity or share aspects of your own unseen identity.
Well, you may wonder why so much attention on diversity right now. Why is it something that we are really focusing on in our communities and in our organizations? And really the reason is that diversity gives us a unique strength. It allows us to better serve communities in a culturally responsive way. It helps us to understand and collaborate with each other better. In fact, we're going to look at some of the advantages that diversity naturally brings with it into our teams. But I'd like to get you to consider the parable. It's an old Hindu parable of the blind people and the elephant. And for me, it's really evocative of explaining why we truly need diverse perspectives in our cities and in our workplaces. So the story is that there are some blind people, and because they are blind, they have never seen an elephant. They've heard stories. They've never had the chance to actually meet or experience an elephant. And so they go on a trip to the palace of the Raja, where there are elephants in residence. And they go to experience and to see, what is this thing? What is this elephant that I've heard so much about? Of course, they can't see the elephant because they're blind. And so to explore and learn, they go to touch the elephant and see if they can get through their sense of touch what this fearsome beast might be. Well, one person here that you can see at the back happens to approach the elephant from behind, and he touches the tail and says, oh, this is a rope. An elephant isn't a big fearsome beast, it's actually a rope. Someone else approaches from the front and happens to touch the tusk of the elephant and says, ooh, it's a spear. There's something sharp and pointy. Elephants are sharp and pointy. Someone else touches the middle of the elephant and says, oh, it's kind of warm, but it's like this big kind of rough wall. Elephants are big and impenetrable, like a big rough wall. And it isn't until they are able to combine their perspectives. What is a rope plus a wall, plus a spear, plus a fan up here, that they can really come to have a full picture of what an elephant is. And what I would submit to you is that we are all the blind people at the elephant. None of us has a complete handle or picture on the complexities that face us and the problems that we're trying to solve in our cities today. And the reason that diversity is especially helpful for all the complex problems we're trying to navigate today is because by being diverse, we are literally standing in different parts of the elephant. We're approaching it from different angles, and we're getting different pieces of information that we can share with each other to create that aha and that understanding of what the elephant might be. So I'm wondering what elephants you might have faced in your past year and in your career, but particularly with all the changes that we have been facing. And Quamina, I would love to know, what have been some of the elephants or the big issues or complex situations that you have faced in the Dean of Students audience? And in particular, how has it been helpful to have diverse members of your team and stakeholders to help inform your picture of what that elephant might be?
Sure, Cindy. So currently, and like many other institutions, CGU is returning our return to campus policies and protocols. And much like your organizations, the safety, security, and well-being of our communities are the priorities that are shaping how we will return. But we haven't done this in isolation. At CGU, we are one of 7 schools within the Claremont Colleges Consortium. However, CGU is graduate only, and that is important to note because our students are not returning to a residential campus with a meal plan or pseudo-parental oversight. Our students are, in many cases, working adults with families of their own. They are enrolled full-time or part-time, and some of our students have experiences across our institutions. A smaller portion of our students are recent undergraduates, and a little over 20% of our students are international. So, in other words, there is no typical graduate student. However, what is common among our entire community, students, staff, and faculty alike, is that they need safety, security, and psychological well-being to be successful. An example of our own elephant is best realized if I talk a little bit about the broad perspectives and the depth of perspectives needed in pre-planning, pivoting, and returning to campus. So the broad perspectives needed across our campuses included perspectives from our academic deans, our student deans, our presidents, health and counseling services, facilities and risk management, marketing and communication, enrollment services, international student services, our Office of Institutional Effectiveness, which I'll explain a little more here soon, our financial officers, campus safety, disaster and preparedness teams, contact tracers, that's a new one, local hospitals and governing agencies, our university council, and of course, our students. An example of the depth of perspectives needed in prioritizing our students' return to campus is best illustrated in our efforts to establish a foundation of wellness and to provide access to resources that address our students' most basic needs. Health insurance, teletherapy and telehealth, tuition insurance, vaccination clinics and testing, international student emergency funds, infrastructure to manage electronic business processes, and grant funding to support mental health initiatives. Diversity of our stakeholders in this process was invaluable. It was invaluable in identifying and prioritizing our efforts. The challenges we faced were opportunities to grow and learn, and our work is not done. Each year, we evaluate usage of these services, of the data, and to assure that our students are using the services and satisfied with the services, while considering the future needs of prospective students by staying in tune with our undergraduate colleagues and tracking trends with their population. None of us could have imagined the complexity of the multiple pandemics we faced this year. The need for diverse teams to work across and within organizations and apply what we're learning for our own collective, from our own collective experiences and through a student-centered lens was pivotal for us in removing barriers for our student success. Thankfully, to date, CGU has not experienced a significant decrease in enrollment or an increase in students taking a leave of absence as a result of the pandemic. However, and as I said, our work is not done and we are listening. Equity and inclusion begins inside the individual and inside the organization. Employing and empowering diverse voices is a business and employee priority. Employees are an organization's largest expense, and organizations should invest in high employee engagement. Investing wisely takes time. However, it does prove to be more sustainable and less costly. Taking advantage of the tools we will discuss today and remaining committed to a lifelong growth mindset will help to position you as a leader in navigating complex decision trees.
There's a lot of evidence that diversity that involves inclusion and equity and belonging is a really powerful force for solving the complex problems, for offering culturally responsive services, and in general, making better decisions as organizational leaders. But it has issues that come along with it too: miscommunication and conflict, and the presence of othering and even systematic bias that may strike people, some people more than others. And othering is a real problem that comes up when diverse people try to interact. Othering is what happens when we look at someone and we see the difference. We see how we are different from that person. Othering is incredibly ubiquitous, and science has shown that you can create othering and bias against others based on even really simple, strange criteria. Like if you look at the picture of dots on this screen, And you can ask somebody, quickly estimate how many dots you think are on on the screen, 50, 200, 1,000. You can show people several of these pictures and then give them feedback that they are either an underestimator, tended to have too low a number, or an overestimator in terms of how many dots. And what we see is that literally just telling people about these groups, these categories, and telling them, okay, there's underestimators and overestimators. You're this one, you're an overestimator. We see all kinds of bias that begins to creep up, much like the bias that occurs across race, gender, age, ethnicity lines. So people believe that if I'm an underestimator, then I also tend to believe underestimators are probably better or probably more cautious. We don't jump into decisions too easily. In economics experiments, it's been shown that I will give more money to a fictional fellow underestimator than I will to someone who I believe to be an overestimator. And what's more, other cognitive biases come into play in terms of looking at and interacting with people across difference. For example, not only are we likely to think that our own group has better qualities, that's the in-group bias, than another group, we're also likely to think that members of an out-group, a group we're not part of, are more similar to each other. So this is how they are. This is how those people are, which can make it difficult for us to individuate someone who's different from us and to really see them as a unique individual. What's more, these personal biases that we bring in to the workplace with us, and sometimes completely unintentionally, also feed into systematic bias in terms of unfairness in the workplace. So imagine a scenario in which you have 10 new hires and your testing evaluation of these hires and their experience and their skills indicates they're about the same as each other. You've hired all 10. But let's say one manager has a bias towards people from top tier universities. And so that person says, okay, I think these 3 who went to an Ivy League school are really going to be my star performers. Then I trust those people to handle the most important projects that come my way. And hopefully I see them succeed and do a good job, which earns greater trust and more responsibility from me, more interaction with upper management, better incentives and promotions. I walk away as the manager saying, see, I'm a great judge of character. Look how great these 3 people did. But what I'm not seeing is, what about the 7 people who didn't get the same opportunities? How would they have done if they had been allowed a chance to shine and lead the way? And that's something I will never know. And so my bias toward top tier universities continues on unchecked, seemingly confirmed by what I have just experienced. But what about those other 7?
Yes, what about those other 7? Cindi, our bias and systematic bias, how it shows up at work, is in our hiring, our evaluation, and our coaching of our teams. It shows up in our day-to-day interactions and in our language. It shows up in meetings when voices are silenced, and in organizational cultures where employees feel they must cover an identity to feel safe. It shows up in our policies, and it shows up in the priorities of those in power. Diversity is complex. Our identities determine how we filter, hide, or downplay part of a known stigmatized identity at work. We do this with our appearance, by changing our hair, through our affiliations, by perhaps, avoiding conversations about families or motherhood during an interview. We do this in our advocacy. Perhaps if you work for a Fortune 500 company, you're less likely to mention that your parents are veterans. And through our associations, for fear of being outed. These populations will attest that Conforming is exhausting. It's exhausting. And there are reasons why covering or keeping an identity private can be misunderstood or mistreated in the workplace. For example, if a coworker often avoids or declines team lunches, they may be perceived as not being a team player. The systematic bias Cindi spoke to is created and reinforced by personal biases. However, if that coworker has a strict dietary restriction due to a medical health condition, will your perception of them be any different? Another way systematic bias shows up at work is in workplace well-being. In this example, placement within an organization is a dimension that adds a layer of complexity to one's intersecting identities. If you are one of a few diverse employees in a leadership role, you are more likely to experience burnout due to the burden placed on you to advocate for and represent on behalf of individuals from your community. In this example, the individual represents the organization and shares an affinity with the constituents that are demanding change of that organization. The employee must navigate unseen identities that could be revealed, stereotypes about their behavior based on known identities and norms. And I'm going to read that one more time. Stereotypes of their behavior based on known identities and norms, and remain authentic to self in their communities. How does it feel for our identities to be in conflict? And how does one choose when they are?
So that leads us, we're in a place of confusion in which we see, well, we're different from each other. Some of us may feel safe expressing some identities, some of us may not, and may need to hide or cover. What can we do as an organization to overcome bias and to create an environment within which people feel free and authentic to show up with their whole selves and with all of the knowledge and perspective and wisdom that is contained within all of those identities? So overcoming bias is achieved through practices of equity and inclusion, both at the individual level and at the team and organizational level. If you don't have diversities, which is multiple identities represented in an organization, then you're likely to have very similar people, a very homogeneous culture, and oversimplified points of view. If you don't have inclusion, and inclusion is the feeling that people belong, that their thoughts and ideas are welcome, that they matter, that they are part of the group. If you don't have inclusion, then you're much more likely to have cultural assimilation and burnout. People feel like, okay, I can be there, but I have to hide, I have to cover. I can't bring the beauty and strength that I know is in my identities with me. And what about equity? Equity is recognizing and redistributing power when you see unfairness in play. And you may have seen this little graphic before. Sometimes managers will say, well, gosh, I'm colorblind, I'm gender blind. You know, why can't people just do their jobs and, you know, forget about these identity policies and politics? But the reason is that equality is not enough because we are not all the same. Our needs are not the same. And equity is about providing according to people's different places around the elephant. So as here in the example, providing one box for people to see the game doesn't really work for two of the three people, and providing a wheelchair ramp or a double box is a better and more equitable solution, so that all three of these people can see the action and ultimately, hopefully, be part of the action too, and be part of receiving power. This stuff is really difficult, though. Trying to create belonging and equity, and trying to reach that sweet spot of belonging there in the center, where people truly feel that they have access to power, they are valued, they are included for all of their identities. And that's where you can really leverage the power of diversity through practicing equity and inclusion. This stuff is really difficult, though. It's for people who have been traumatized or marginalized, it can be exhausting and even painful and re-traumatizing to explore issues of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, much like Quamina just expressed. For people who have not been marginalized, it can also be really difficult. We make mistakes and we're afraid of being ashamed or embarrassed, or of harming other people accidentally because of our lack of understanding or the way that we try to be inclusive. And one tool that I encourage you to use as you enter these difficult waters and these difficult conversations and this process of self-discovery and of organizational change is mindful self-compassion. It's seeing yourself, picture yourself just like this person you can see in the screen at a river. And the river is the difficulty of a complex situation. Maybe it's the social unrest that has come up recently with all of the social justice movements and the corresponding Blue Lives Matter in response to that, storming of the Capitol. Maybe it's a difficult conversation with an out-group member coworker that you just can't seem to understand or see the same perspective. When you feel yourself embroiled in something that feels difficult or painful or brings up fear, I encourage you to use mindful self-compassion. Picture yourself actually sitting there at, or even maybe in, this river, this muddy river, this turmoil with debris and sticks. And but know that as you watch yourself there, you will have the power to address this situation. If you look as from the role of an observer and you see, wow, there I am, and I'm struggling with this, feel some compassion and some love and some pride for your courage for being able to stay there in the river rather than running away from something that might be difficult or painful. See if you can gaze around the banks of the river to see what supporters might show up there for you from your personal life, your professional life, those whom you know or those who have inspired you with their leadership and their strength, even those who have come before you and can provide a sense of ancestral strength for you to draw upon as you navigate these difficult waters. Seeing yourself at a distance and giving yourself almost the warm blanket of encouragement and encouraging yourself to seek support and help, and even maybe help damming up true injustice when you see it in the river, is a way to stay centered and calm and to remain open to a situation that's difficult and possibly painful and that you don't know how it will resolve. And so it's a really important tool, sort of in the spirit of putting on your own oxygen mask before reaching out to help others or reaching out to address inequity that you might see. We have several other suggestions for you for ways to practice inclusion and empathy too. And we hope that these will be helpful for you as you navigate these difficult waters. One practice that you can use just as a person is practicing individuating other people. Research shows that when we see we see photographs of people of different races than our own. Research that's been done in neuroscience shows that our stress levels actually go up. We experience some minor sense of fight or flight just looking at photographs of people who are different from us, because that difference can be triggering of all of these kinds of fears or experiences or trauma that we might have experienced. But a simple intervention actually completely eliminated the rise of cortisol and stress hormones in subjects looking at those pictures. And you know what it was? Literally asking the people to say, before you look at these pictures of people, I want you to try to make a judgment. Do they prefer peas or carrots? So as the people looked at the same photographs of people different from themselves, rather than just looking at these faces, they were asked to think about and predict, does this person like peas or carrots? And that significantly reduced the stress level by moving the person from an out-group member, an other, into simply another unique individual who might like peas or carrots.
Thank you, Cindy. Other ways we can practice inclusion and equity is in expanding our circle of activities, contacts, and learning. Leading with empathy and emotional intelligence is already a solid recipe to promote equity and inclusion. As mentioned, bias shows up in how we interact and also in our language. So first, start by expanding your circle to include a lifelong growth mindset by building trusting relationships that are authentic, learning about difference and asking about the needs and preferences of others. Small steps we can take are in becoming familiar with gender neutral language, replacing terms such as master in master spreadsheet with primary spreadsheet, spending time learning common definitions heard today, and understanding the impact of microaggressions. Being mindful of the sources that provide information by changing your media outlet. Seek podcasts, books, and movies with authors, actors, and presenters that represent communities different than your own. Do not depend on members of these communities to provide you with the information. Your colleagues are exhausted, and it is not fair to expect that they educate your teams or your communities. Listen and avoid discrediting shared stories or minimizing the impact of the experience. Replace blame with curiosity and offer flexible options that identify and build advantages. As Cindy mentioned, we can reframe tensions as opportunities to learn by pausing instead of reacting to triggering or gaslighting behavior. Separate the person from their statement or behavior and assume positive intentions.
Please go ahead.
Remain open and ask for feedback by seeking to understand instead of enforcing one's own view or reinforcing norms that were never intended to fit everyone. When we do so based on assumptions. When we seek to understand, we give ourselves permission to be vulnerable and make mistakes. We're going to get it wrong because we cannot know every culture. However, being uncomfortable is a very small sacrifice of doing the work that changes you from the inside out. Cindy?
Be sure to mind the gap between intention and impact. In other words, I hope very few of us are actively racist or sexist, that we truly do not like or do not want to interact with people who are different from us. But things like microaggressions, small statements that are hurtful to people, even without our intention, are still possible to happen. I once told a gender fluid student, I like gender fluid people because I think they have really self-examined and they're really self-aware and they're really interesting. And that student said to me, I would like to be liked for being me, not for being a gender fluid person. And I realized that in trying to be an ally, I had actually microaggressed. And so there was a gap between my intention and the impact of my words. And that's why we all have to listen. We have to listen and we have to respect the impact that we've had on other people, even if it hasn't been our intention to be harmful. You can also look into, as an organization and as a leader, bias interrupters, or ways that you can address inequities in your actual systems. Just as one brief example, in hiring and selection, if you can use metrics-based hiring, in which you are carefully evaluating employees for their knowledge, skills, and abilities that are relevant to that job posting, and less so for fit for the team, because fit for the team is sometimes code for assimilation into one way of doing things. And this is something that will limit our success as we try to serve diverse communities. And finally, make sure that you reward and invest in diversity, inclusion, and equity development.
That's right, Cindy. When we invest in this area, we begin to foster building psychological safety and belonging. And so when I look at this year, when we think about how we invested, many of us became a lot more mindful about where we spent our money, the philosophies and initiatives of different organizations that we supported. And I encourage folks to continue that work, not only with our pocketbooks, but also in our process of selecting our employers or the communities in which we serve and live. So we all have privileges. We're here today, so that means that we have some identity that puts us in a place of privilege. And we all have influence to make a difference, and they can be the smallest of things, speaking to our language, or again, a spectrum of things that also includes where we spend our money and time. So as you continue your journey, we also encourage you to invite others along. Later in our slides, we're going to give you some texts and references that have been referred to throughout today's presentation, but we're not quite there yet. So let's talk a little bit about how organizations measure their progress. There aren't very many organizations employing best practices, or what you see here on the spectrum is level 5. To be exemplary for other organizations globally is aspirational. In the year 2025, about 75% of the global workforce will be millennials, and they will occupy leadership roles over the next decade. In other words, early adopters of supportive environments and cultures of inclusivity are positioned to recruit and retain our best and brightest rising leaders, and the resilience of organizations and the communities they serve will be dependent upon the psychological capital of those leaders and the communities they serve. So before we move on to question and answer, I ask that you think about where your organization is along the spectrum. Please drop a 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 in the chat to let us know where you believe your organization fits. And while you're thinking about this, I would like to recommend a book, The Sum of Us by Heather McGhee. This text draws on racism and social justice as issues that impact all of us and reminds us that until we include the corners and edges of our society, we will continue to pay the cost. As you move forward in your day and over the remaining weeks of our series, I want to encourage you to do both seeing around corners and in dismantling and disrupting zero-sum mindsets that prevent us from making available the most basic resources to our communities. At the end of the presentation, again, we'll share some text and references, and you'll hear from Regina as well as Cindi about our customized leadership program.
Now we'd like to know if you have any questions for us as we get ready to wrap up our presentation. Regina?
Thank you, Quamina. Thank you, Cindi, for your presentation. That was great. And Cindi, before I go to Q&A, would you remove the PowerPoint slides?
Absolutely.
And we are receiving a lot of questions from you, and please submit more if you're interested in the chat room, actually in the Q&A chat function. I am hearing from people saying that sometimes they're the sole ethnic minority in their organizations and they are tired. There's a lot of expectations, and also they need to explain a lot of things, and they feel fatigued, and because the company is putting a huge weight on them. And also I'm hearing we have someone who is, she says she's an Asian female engineer in the organization in the city where she's the only one, and she feels very much alone. And I'm also hearing people sharing about their own privileges, you know, having attended an Ivy League school and seeing that her high school friends that did not go to such university just have not had the same experiences and opportunities as she has. And now I have one question here. It says that, how can you bring your whole self to work when, even if your fellow employees can appreciate diversity, there's an expectation of being neutral, since we are city employees expected to serve all without sharing specific opinions and experiences?
Right. I'll start, and Cindi, absolutely, if you have things to add, please jump in. This is a difficult spot to navigate, and we only began to touch on it. You know, I think what we need to get to is their direct question, right? How do I navigate this inside the actual brick and mortar, or this past year, virtual spaces? But I think even prior to that, there's a lot of work that we, particularly a Black woman, have to do even before we show up. And that is in how we take care of ourselves. That is in our communities, our tribe, our resources, our therapists, our whatever it is that we need to feel whole before we even walk into the building. Then once we walk in, of course, there are things that, depending on how long you've been on this earth, there are things that are just a little harder to undo. So if you have an identity that you are used to hiding, it is not always so comfortable to unveil that identity. And you should be careful before you unveil that identity. Everyone is not worthy of trusting that they will protect and preserve the things that are valuable and important to you. But to get directly to how do I move in this space with an organization, boy, if we had that answer. What I do know is that it's a multi-pronged approach, and that leadership is pivotal in how the organization moves. And it is important that not only the top, but everyone across the organization is doing their part to carry the load. It cannot fall on human resources or a diversity officer or a diversity, equity, and inclusion committee alone. It has to be multi-pronged and ideally supported by a long-term strategic plan. So that's my immediate sort of response. But again, that's a big one to unpack. And I'd love to talk more about the investing and the financials all associated with how we do this work. But my perspective now is really going to be from that wellness point of view and just sort of putting on your armor in a way that helps to make you feel safe in your workplace.
Thank you, Quamina. And the next question we have is, how can we bring along young, low-income white men that are facing their own struggles and challenges and feel left out when we discuss diversity and inclusion? How can we speak to them and coalesce around shared values and goals?
I'll take a stab at that. It's difficult because there are people who see diversity, equity, and inclusion as somehow being a zero-sum game. That, in other words, we're looking to empower people who have been marginalized, and that means by definition, people who have been in privileged positions like white men are asked to, we're knocking them off the tower, we're knocking them off they don't get any more pie, basically. And that's a fear, that's a real fear for people. And so evidence for the value of diverse perspectives in terms of financial outcomes and well-being outcomes for everyone, as well as evidence suggesting that perhaps this is not a fixed pie, zero sum, I win, you lose kind of an effort, but one in which we actually can grow a bigger pie and have more room for everybody. And that absolutely includes that young white man who's struggling to find his way in the world. There's room for everybody, and there's true value and benefit in terms of all of our well-being, because we are not really going to have well-being, all of us, until we have inclusion and equity for all of us.
Thank you, Cindi. And I have these two questions, I'll merge them into one, which is, any ideas to address DEI in municipalities that have to deal with rigid and outdated hiring, promotional, and reward system?
Wow, we could both speak to this, and I'm sort of thinking of you, Cindi, with your HR lens, but I'm also thinking about some really good work we've been doing. Again, starting with the foundation, moving away from the example of that foundation as being wellness, but in a very interesting way, there are some similarities, and looking at the foundation of our office, our workplace, in terms of policies, and just one by one. Over this year, we actually began going through those policies and specifically looking for language that describes gender identities. And through that exercise, we were able to identify many places where we needed to update our policies. And so it's a huge thing to tackle, but we do it one thing at a time. And as ideas come up for you, write that down, but follow through and continue to do this work every day. There are absolutely things we can do. Many of our policies are archaic. I'm often floored by some of the language that I see, not only at CGU, but just policies that have been recycled over the years. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. And I fear that when people talk about dismantling, that there is a urge to want to preserve something there. And dismantling is actually saying what I just described. Let's look at it, let's change it. It has to be updated, and let's move forward. But there's something about that word and the idea of what was done in the past just can no longer feels threatening. So I do think it's also in our approach, is my point, how we approach this matter with our colleagues, with our supervisors, and with our organization. But that foundation is in our policies.
Thank you. And the last question I have is, how do I communicate with the executive team that I'm concerned with the lack of female representation on the leadership team?
Well, usually from a leadership perspective, there are strategic goals, financial goals, and the like that are most influential in the decision making for senior leaders. So come prepared with evidence for the value in terms of finance, in terms of success for goal attainment. And there is a lot of evidence out there, both from the private sector and the public sector. So secondary data is your friend. Primary data is your friend too. And this is, again, about rather than trying to take someone else's perspective, we seek it, we ask. So we ask our employees, we ask our citizens and other stakeholders. We ask about needs and goals and equity and inclusion, and that brings us armed with persuasive data. And that's usually what is most influential for senior decision makers.
Thank you.
So I'll just add, Cindy, if you don't mind, when I referenced earlier in our presentation, our Office of Institutional Effectiveness, this is why throughout this entire process, and when we talked about the depth and breadth of our teams and diverse perspectives, throughout this process, we have been surveying and asking questions of our community. So we didn't make these decisions in isolation or only from the top down. Our communities have been involved every step of the way.
And that's crucial. And leaders across all sectors are realizing that the old command and control top-down decision-making structures just do not work with the complexities and the rapid change that all of us are facing in our organizations.
Thank you, Cindy. Would you bring back the slides? Great. And we just thank you for so many questions. They're just wonderful. If you have more questions, please email, you can email Quamina, you can email Cindy, and we'll get them answered.
We also have a new master's degree program that might be of interest to public sector employees. It's a 12 to 16 month master's degree in leadership. It's brand new at CGU. It's a hybrid model in which you would come to campus once a month and then attend classes remotely throughout the program. And we're offering an inaugural fellowship for the first class of this brand new program of 35% tuition discount. So I encourage anyone who's interested in any of the topics that you've been hearing about in our webinar series to consider joining or seeking more information about this program. And Regina can help you, help direct you if you're interested. We also, as promised, have a list of resources that we have found to be useful in our own journeys and our own organization's journey toward belonging for employees. And so we encourage you to consult these and to reach out to us if you would like more resources across multiple media. Regina?
Great. Thank you for being here. And I really want to appreciate just Cindy and Quamina for pointing out how inclusion, equity, and to create a sense of belonging is really a win-win for all of us. Thank you so much. And next Tuesday, we'll be back with Gloria Gonzalez-Morales. She's the Associate Professor of Psychology at CGU, and she would talk about when stressors make you grow, which is a very important topic these days. I think we can all feel the stressors. Again, thank you for being here, and we'll see you at 10 next Tuesday. Have a very good day. Bye-bye.
Hi, everyone, and thank you.